The Parliamentary Secretary.
What a great day for the Central Coast, Mr President. And on that note, it's great to see the #1 advocate for the repeal of the War Act, the Parliamentary Secretary for the Central Coast, here in the gallery, the Honourable Adam Crouch MP. And I rise to support the Warnervale Airport Restrictions Repeal Bill 2020 because this bill removes the Warnervale Airport Restrictions Act 1996, otherwise known as the War Act. And it means the Warnervale aircraft landing area, as it is currently known, will be regulated just like every other aircraft landing area in this state. And Warnervale Airport is not unique. It is a small airport on the Central Coast with a sealed single runway measuring 10 metres wide and approximately 1,196 metres long. The runway is limited to aircraft with a 5,700 kilogram maximum takeoff weight. Despite its limited size, the airport at Warnervale is a vital asset for the Central Coast. The airport supports emergency services such as police, air ambulance, RFS and fire reconnaissance. It provides aviation-related education and skills training, including qualification of recreational and commercial pilots, as well as flight instructors. It hosts the Australian Air League and Scouts. It provides skilled employment opportunities and apprenticeship training, such as the current thriving maintenance operation conducted at the airport. It facilitates tourism. It benefits local small businesses as well as recreational flying opportunities for local residents. Importantly, Mr President, it provides the only fuel stop and emergency landing area between Bankstown and Newcastle. Despite Warnervale Airport's facilities and operations being no different to any other aircraft landing area around New South Wales, there is one thing that sets Warnervale Airport apart from the others: the War Act. A recent review of the War Act by Abigail Goldberg and Peter Fagan found that, and I quote, "The Act is without precedent in that it is the only item of legislation of its kind in place for a local airport. While there are many general airport and aviation acts, airport-specific legislation is unusual. The key example uncovered by the reviewers is the Sydney Airport Curfew Act 1995. Mr President, during Portfolio Committee 7's recent inquiry into the bill, Mr Fagan said that there are at least 739 airports that they looked into in their review. His finding was, and I quote, "None had legislation." So why Warnervale? What's so special about Warnervale that means that it has its own act that we call the War Act? Well, Mr President, a cynical person might say it was a direct result of Labor cross-governmental level infighting in the mid-90s. Lucky for those opposite, I'm not a cynical person. In 1994, the former Wyong Shire had granted plans to establish a freight hub serviced by jet aircraft. By 1996, these plans were well advanced, and I make no judgment about residents who were concerned by these plans, that's for sure. Many of them had lived in the area for a very long time, were fearful about what was being proposed by their local council. As a result, the local member for Wyong at that time, Paul Crittenden, proposed the War Act. This was, and still is, a rather rare occurrence. A member of the government of the day proposing a private member's bill. The bill limited the size of the runway, it imposed a curfew, and it outlined the process for any extension of the runway. And most importantly, it imposed a flight cap should there be any breaches of that act. And I'll come to that cap later on, Mr President. The concern over this development proposed in the mid-90s was echoed by the opposition at the time in 1996. And in fact, my predecessor, the Honourable Mike Gallagher, in his second reading contribution on that private member's bill, which was actually his third speech in this place, said, and I quote, "As a result of the evidence presented to the opposition to this date, the opposition supports the bill. The social and environmental costs of having large jet aircraft flying in and out of Warnervale 24 hours a day is simply not on." The Act passed both Houses of Parliament without a division and was assented to in July 1996. Mr President, I note the contribution by the Honourable Mike Gallagher where he said, and I quote, "As a result of the evidence presented to the opposition at this date, the opposition supports the bill." Because in the 24 years that have passed, Mr President, very much has changed indeed. The first point is that an expansion of the airport to cater for aircraft larger than it currently does is now an impossibility. At the southern end of the runway, there is the Porters Creek wetland, which is a wetland under the State Environmental Planning Policy Coastal Management 2018. At the northern end, approximately 100 metres beyond the end of the runway, is Sparks Road, a main road providing access to residents in suburbs such as Toukley, the Canwell, Gorican, and of course over to the F3. Now, beyond Sparks Road is quite a large hill that would require significant earthworks to remove that. And to the west is a large Woolworths distribution centre. To the east, there are significant residential areas. Mr. President, it is no longer an option for the runway to be extended well beyond its current size. The other major change that has happened has been the extension of the runway in 2015 by the then Wyong Council. According to the now Central Coast Council, those works were at the time considered essential maintenance. A subsequent compliance investigation by the then Department of Planning and Environment, however, determined that the former Wyong Shire Council had extended the runway, thereby triggering the statutory flight movements restriction. And in July 2019, the Central Coast Council formed the opinion that sections 5 and 6 of the War Act had probably been triggered by the works carried out in 2015 by the then Wyong Shire Council. The newly amalgamated Central Coast Council implemented procedures to comply with the curfew under the War Act and the daily limit on flight movements prescribed by the Act. Mr. President, the impact on the operations at the airport have actually been profound since. Central Coast Council imposed a requirement that pilots must seek permission from the airport operator to land or take off not less than 24 hours beforehand by application in writing. According to the Central Coast Aero Club, this resulted in a near impossible administrative and financial burden on them. It resulted in severe restrictions on training flights and scheduling those training flights and rescheduling them in the case of short notice. And the general aviation community had the view that Warnervale is unfriendly to aviators. In its submission to the parliamentary inquiry, the Aero Club outlined why 24 hours of notice is completely impractical for general aviation. The requirement prevents flights for people on a particular day, say due to their changing circumstances overnight or on short notice, could not change the flight due to that 24-hour notice. It prevents drop-in members of the public perhaps wanting to do a joy flight or even to reschedule training flights. Importantly, it could be quite the impediment for passing aircraft to land in order to pick up some fuel. Andrew Smith, the CEO of the Central Coast Aero Club, also explained how the flight cap of 88 movements has restricted training flights, and I quote, "The most important part of a student's journey to their licence is learning to land the aircraft, so we spend a lot of time doing what are called circuits. We take off, do a lap, and we do what are called touch and goes. A touch and go is where we touch down, accelerate and get airborne again without exiting the runway. That is counted as 2 movements because it is both a landing and a takeoff. We can do 10 of those in 1 hour in one of our training of our aircraft. So that is 20 movements per hour. We often have 3 to 4 in the air at a time. If we start at 7:30 a.m, we can hit 88 movements by 9:30 in the morning." Mr. Deputy President, I want to thank the Minister for Planning and Public Spaces, the Honourable Rob Stokes MP, for meeting with Mr. Smith and others from the Central Coast Aero Club at the Central Coast Community Cabinet that was held in 2019. The Minister understands the problems that the club have and initiated the independent review of the War Act by Ms Abigail Goldberg, an expert in infrastructure, urban planning and governance, and Mr Peter Fegan, who was put forward as the Council's representative on that review. Mr Fegan has a 47-year career in aviation and executive management with qualifications as a pilot, an accident investigator, an air traffic controller, aircraft engineer and a risk and safety manager. Mr Deputy President, this review made a number of recommendations which this bill will deliver, namely the removal of the flight cap at the first opportunity, along with the ultimate repeal of the bill. This repeal will occur once Central Coast Council has sufficient time to allow for appropriate local planning controls and business and operations plans to be prepared and put in place to address the future operations and changes proposed for the airport. The Council has up to 3 years to do this. Mr Deputy President, this action has significant community support, which is demonstrated by the submissions made to both the Goldberg-Fegan review as well as by the inquiry held by Portfolio Committee number 7. The independent inquiry received feedbacks and submissions from 939 people and organisations. Of those, approximately 25% were in favour of the retention of the Act, while 75% of those 939 people surveyed supported the Act being repealed, which is what we are doing here tonight. Mr Deputy President, I want to thank...
Before we go on, are we supposed to be applying a degree of reverence?
It's you two.
Yes, yes we are. Well,
Ask the Health Minister.
Well, that's all very good, isn't it? Thank you, Mr. President.
we're under the rules,
Yeah.
as I understand. I think it's not unreasonable. I know that some conversation has occurred. It's not unreasonable. Sorry. Well,
Thank you, Mr Deputy President. Mr Deputy President, finally, the War Act is now a source of uncertainty for the Central Coast Aero Club, and simply removing the flight cap would not eliminate that risk in its entirety. For more than 20 years, the Act existed in the background and was suddenly triggered without warning or consultation as a result of what could be described as a mistake by the Council several years earlier. The War Act, even without a movement restriction, is now, and I quote, an existential threat. In the words of the Aero Club. It's been a big day.
That was not their words.
It's been a big day. Given the substantial other superior legislation that exists, it is preferable that the existential threat simply be repealed. It is clear that the only course of action available is the full repeal of this legislation, and the independent inquiry by Ms Goldberg and Mr Peter Fegan found that to be the case. Government has followed the recommendations when drafting the repeal bill. The community is supportive of the repeal, and finally, while Portfolio Committee 7 made no recommendations supporting or opposing the bill, the evidence received by the committee was overwhelming in its support to repeal the War Act. Mr Deputy President, I'd like to thank my colleagues, particularly the Minister for Planning and Public Spaces in the other place, the Honourable Rob Stokes MP, and the Parliamentary Secretary for the Central Coast, Adam Crouch MP, for their efforts in getting to this point today. And I thank the Central Coast Aero Club, including its directors, its CEO, Mr Andrew Smith, and its members, who have been extremely professional and patient as the government has embarked on the process of reviewing and subsequently repealing this legislation. And I acknowledge Mr John Codrington, the chair of your Central Coast Airport Association, for his support on this issue. And I also want to thank members of the community who participated in both the independent review and the parliamentary inquiry, including Mr Laurie Eyes, who, while we may have differing opinions on this issue and a range of other issues across the Central Coast, to be perfectly frank, he is extremely committed in his community activism, that is for sure, and I commend the bill.
The Honourable Taylor Martin.
Globo?
Yes.
Yes.
They can be put as a single vote.
Thank you, Mr Deputy President. With these amendments, the Greens are persisting with the erroneous assertion the only thing wrong with the War Act is the movement cap. The review by Goldberg and Fegan found a long list of problems with the Act, which are outlined on pages 29 to 32 of the report, which include the fact that legislation is duplicated, definitions are lacking, the fact that pilots don't refer to legislation when planning for flights, nor should they have to. Enforcement is unrealistic and expensive. Penalties are poorly defined. There is no exit plan when restrictions are triggered. The Council is no longer the consent authority for its own developments. Superior community, environmental, noise and safety protections exist elsewhere. The review reflected on whether the Act could be improved by amendments instead of repeal. If members look at the report, on page 30 is a list of amendments that could be made to update the Act if the cost or complexity was not an issue. It is right there in black and white, Mr Deputy President. Basically, the reviewers did the Greens' job for them. But it's clear the Greens have not read that report, because instead we get these amendments here tonight that simply remove the movement cap and change the wording to reflect the current local government area, while leaving the rest of the Act with all of its issues that I've outlined intact. The Central Coast deserves better, and we should not continue to be held back unnecessarily any longer.